as mere coincidence.
Interesting. Well, I have talked to a couple of remote viewers, and, one of them was in the military, and that's what they did. And, they had a success rate. It was really high. Now, the government claims they disbanded the remote viewing. I've been told by a few people that work in different parts of the government that that's not true, that they still have remote viewers. I know that Russia does, and I'm sure other countries do. And just from the standpoint to be able to use your brain and psychic power, it's crazy. I'm going to be honest with you. I ride a motorcycle, and my motorcycle has a security device, and it has a fob on it. It won't start without that. I looked everywhere for about 2-3 weeks. I had a psychic on my show, and all of a sudden she goes, "You're looking for a key." I go, "Yeah, I am actually." She told me exactly right where it was. And I can't to this day. I mean, she didn't ask any questions trying to hint where, where I could give her hints where I think I might have left it. She knew right where it was at and told me. And guess what? During the break, I walked there, and guess what? It was right where she told me it was.
I hear many stories like that, and that's what some of the scientific studies are pointing towards as well, that these abilities are, number one, they're innate, so that we all have them, but just in some cases they're to a lesser degree. So we don't notice them. They're not as extreme. They're just kind of percentage points above chance, which is still something really significant, and that's kind of the everyday person. And then we have people at the U.S. government program or the person that you mentioned who might have above average abilities. So it's kind of like, I think about it as a distribution, where you have outliers that are incredible, and then you have other people that have the ability, but it's just really slight. So it's like in basketball. Anyone can dribble a basketball, but you only have a few people like Michael Jordan that are at the far end of the extreme that are really, really talented. And I think we have that distribution for psychic phenomena as well.
Oh, yeah. And, I now this is maybe going off the subject a little bit, but I had a guest on here that basically I had a watch. It didn't work. And whatever he did, whatever he did over there talking to me, he got my watch to work. Figure that one out. I haven't been able to figure that one out at all.
Well, there's a phenomenon known as psychokinesis, which is another chapter in my book. Again, each chapter is kind of looking at the evidence for these types of phenomena. And psychokinesis is the ability for the mind to affect physical matter without physical contact. And this is something that sounds totally ridiculous and impossible if we take the conventional perspective that consciousness just pops out of the brain and it has no effect on the world. But if we flip the paradigm, if we end the upside-down thinking and regard consciousness as being primary, then it would make sense that the way we shift our consciousness would actually sort of mold physical reality, at least conceptually. So the question is there any evidence that could actually occur? I mentioned earlier that at Princeton, the former dean of engineering had a lab. It was called the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab. One of the studies relates directly to this phenomenon of psychokinesis, mind affecting matter. The classic study uses computer machines, and they're called random number generators. So these are machines that will generate zeros and ones in a completely random fashion. So if you end up looking at the string of zeros and ones after a long period of time, you end up with 50% ones, 50% zeros, because it's a random process. What the experimenters did was they did two types of studies I'll talk about. One is they asked people to consciously put their attention to the machines and try to will it to produce more ones and zeros without any physical contact. It's pure mental intention. And what they found is that there is a very slight but highly statistically significant effect where it's slightly more ones than zeros, and you wouldn't know it unless you use the statistics to see that it's a deviation from what the traditional machine without any influence would produce. So it's suggesting, like what you described, that there is a mental impact on physical reality. Maybe it's not always as extreme as what you described with your watch working versus not working. Maybe it's much more subtle in some cases.
Well, how about what they did in labs where a psychic would, they hand them a fork or a knife or whatever it was, or a spoon, and with their psychic abilities, they were managed to, kind of bend the spoon, and and that has been proven to actually have happened. So I think the mind has a lot more powers that that we can't even comprehend, and the abilities of the brain.
I completely agree with you. And there have been some strong reports of bending metal with the mind, and I mentioned a number of those as well in the book, because they are reported on by so many credible people that it really makes you wonder. And when you combine it with the credibility of the studies at Princeton, that there is a statistical effect, then why couldn't that effect be stronger in some other cases where you can actually see something shifting? So I'm much more open to these ideas after having seen this accumulated evidence.
Well, I would be. A friend of mine who's deceased now, but Art Bell, I don't know if you ever heard him. He did a national talk show for many, many years on the radio. Mm-hmm. And, he did an experiment with, his listeners. Basically, there was a major storm, and it was basically, they all thought one thing: the storm, kind of like disappeared. And it happened, and it scared him, because he started realizing if you do that, it can shift and cause other problems down the road. But he did, I think, that once or twice as an experiment, with literally, millions of listeners. And, he really thought that, our brain can change things.
I have heard of cases like that, and there's a book called PK Man. PK means psychokinesis, and it's written by Jeffrey Mishlove, who is a PhD in parapsychology. The PK Man was a person who had abilities along the lines of what you described, where his mind apparently, and there were so many reports of this that this PhD wrote a book on it, where he was able to adjust major things like weather patterns using his mental abilities.
Oh, I believe that. Could you imagine some foreign countries and stuff, creating hurricanes and all this stuff by using mass, brain power to create it?
It's an important question. Like, what are the ethics of all this? And so I have my own podcast that will be coming out in the next few months, where I've already interviewed nearly 50 people, many of the people that I discuss in my book. And one of them is Uri Geller, who is famous for using his mind to bend spoons, and he was actually involved in the U.S. government program. I include some documents that the CIA declassified, where they say that he was able to do remote viewing tasks in a clear and unambiguous manner. So these are documents declassified from 1973. In any case, I think that lends some credibility to his claims in general. But I asked him something along the lines of what you just said. I said, Yuri, are you ever afraid that you will use your mental ability to do something harmful? Like, you can bend spoons, and that's totally benign, but what if you're on an airplane? Are you worried that you're going to bend the wings? And what he said, Mark, it's a really interesting question. What he noticed about his abilities is that they seem to shut off if the intent is not a positive one, and he can't explain it.
Well, maybe that could all depend on the person's morals and makeup, and how a person actually takes life on. If you got somebody that, let's say, is schizophrenic, for example, and have those powers, then I got a funny feeling those powers could be used, well, I hate to say it, in the dark side, in something that's not so good. And that's where, that, and I do think that actually goes on. I think there is people out there that have powers to create thought in other people's brain or cause other problems. And I think it's all done by, communication with their brain. And again, I don't know. This is a really interesting topic, which I really don't have any answers for. That's why I'm trying to plug it from you, because this is kind of eerie.
Yeah, well, you're asking great questions, and these are the sorts of things that I spend most of my time thinking about these days and really trying to figure it out. But I think there's a point that we kind of glossed over that is really important for your listeners to realize, because this was a shock to me, which is that in science, there is openly a question about consciousness. It's known as the hard problem of consciousness, And Science Magazine, which is a totally mainstream outlet, they put out their top 25 questions that remain in all of science. And number 2 on the list, number 2 in all of science is, and I'll give a direct quote and I'll explain it next, what is the biological basis of consciousness? And what does that mean? If I ask you to touch your leg, that's really easy to do. If I ask you to touch your arm, that's easy. So your body's physical. If I ask you to touch your mind, right, you can't. And this is what the hard problem of consciousness is getting at. This is what Science Magazine is getting at. We know our consciousness exists. We are all aware right now. And it's not physical. It's not touchable. And yet our body, which is alleged to produce that consciousness, the body is physical. So how is it that something non-physical magically arises out of our physical body? That's the open question that science has not figured out an answer to. So if we start there with the mainstream issue that, look, we all acknowledge in science that this is a massive question, we are often assuming that, well, yeah, we don't know the answer yet, but consciousness must come from the brain because we know there's a strong relationship between what happens to our brain and the type of conscious experience we have. So someone gets in a car accident. Maybe they have memory loss because they have brain damage. So look, we see their brain changes, their conscious state changes. Or another example, let's say we take an electrode and stimulate a part of the brain, maybe the visual cortex, the part of the brain that changes vision. You stimulate that part of the brain, and the person has a change in their vision. Again, we change the brain, we change the consciousness. Now, why is that not sufficient using just general logic? Why is it not sufficient to then say, oh, well, the brain definitely produces consciousness? The issue is one that in the statistical community, people will say correlation does not imply causation. Now, what does that mean? It means that just because two things are related does not tell us that we can say one is causing the other. Not necessarily. So an example is, imagine that you have a fire. Lots of firefighters show up at the scene. You have a larger fire, more firefighters show up. So here we have a really strong relationship, a strong correlation between how large the fire is and the number of firefighters that are showing up. But we don't conclude that the firefighters are causing the fire. There is another relationship, and that might be the error that's going on with consciousness right now in mainstream science. There's this assumption of, well, we don't know how the brain produces it, but there's a correlation, so it must be that the brain's producing it. Wait a second. What if the brain is, like I said before, a processor of consciousness, like an antenna receiver or a filtering mechanism? That would show us the same pattern, where if you damage the antenna, so to speak, like if you're watching television and the antenna is damaged, you might get a fuzzy show on your screen. But that's not because the signal has been damaged. All that's been damaged is the processor of the signal, and the signal is containing the information for the show. So it's like our brain, just using this logical line of inquiry, an alternative possibility is that the brain is processing consciousness rather than producing it. And that would explain all of these phenomena that you and I are discussing.
Well, I think it would. But here's the thing. If somebody has the ability to, like, bend a spoon or to actually, like mystics or these people that are able to, well, talk to the living, dead, I should say, the departed ones. If they had that ability, or if they have the ability to, let's say, change the weather, can it have other repercussions where, you're trying to change something and you think you're doing it for the good, but it actually could be doing some other damage, down the road from what you're trying to accomplish?
Absolutely. I think implications have to be thought through. I mean, and the ethical concerns are important considerations. I don't think these are even coming up in the mainstream because people haven't accepted, in general, they haven't accepted the reality of these phenomena. So to me, the first step is to acknowledge their reality, try to explain them, and then we need to figure out how to live with this reality and how we act according to what people can do.
Yeah. Now, I just now remember what Art Bell did. It was a major storm. It was coming in a certain area. And what he did is he had his listeners focus on that storm to make it not, powerful like it was supposed to be. and it did not do what they claimed it was supposed to do. It, this